Harvey, I'm confident represents sort of the reasonable worst case scenario. Like in our lifetimes, if we see another flood storm like that, we need to get out.
Yeah.
Houston will not be home anymore if that happens again, because that was really a historic storm.
Hey y'all, thanks for finding the Houston is Home podcast, where we celebrate the people and places that make Houston home. Every time you listen, we hope you learn something new about the greater Houston area, from inside the loop to the suburbs, maybe a cool spot you haven't visited, or hear an amazing story from someone who calls Houston home. We're glad you're here with us, and we hope you enjoy.
We're so glad to be back here at the Houston is Home podcast, and we have an amazing guest, Eric Berger, who is a certified meteorologist. Eric has written about weather in the Houston area for more than a decade. You may have seen his hurricane coverage in the Houston Chronicle as Eric SciGuy Berger, but now he brings that same kind of no-nonsense coverage of weather in and around Houston, the Space City weather. Eric, we're so glad to have you here. We're just passionate about what you do and the knowledge and everything that you share with our great city. So first off, we're grateful for you, and we want to share that, and just grateful for the time that we have with you today. So I appreciate that.
Well, it's nice to talk to you today, Austin and Charity.
Yeah, definitely. So tell us a little bit about yourself. How long have what got you into weather and meteorology and going through that route?
Yeah, so it's almost 2 decades old now. But the real formative event for me was Tropical Storm Allison back in 2001. That was a major flood storm for the Texas Medical Center in near downtown Houston and parts of the eastern city. And I distinctly remember it because that night, I had been a reporter at the Chronicle by then for a couple of years. And with some friends that night, it was a Friday night. And we went out to see a show on Washington to see Bob Schneider actually play. And I remember being in the club and hearing the sound of rain on the roof being louder than the music itself. I'd only been in Houston at that point for about 4 years, so I'd never really experienced a true tropical event. And so when I walked outside, I don't know, it was like 11:30, maybe midnight. Sort of the intensity of it all was pretty overwhelming. And at the time, I had just bought a house in Oak Forest, which was a neighborhood north of I-610 along White Oak Bayou. And I remember I was not able to drive from Washington Avenue across I-10 to get up there to my house, because I-10 was a canal and some of the roads were underwater. And so I remember parking on a median, and some of my other friends either were in Montrose or other places. And so we sort of linked back up. And I just remember that night sort of tromping around kind of the Montrose area pretty much all night, because I couldn't get home. And it was just kind of wild to be out in this tropical storm. So, you did everything you're not supposed to do, right? Walk into high water and things like that. But I was younger than, in my 20s. So it was really kind of an adventure. And I just remember after that, I had a background in astronomy, and so I was writing about science for the Chronicle. I just never really wanted to be caught by surprise like that again, because I certainly had not expected that kind of situation. I was pretty oblivious to it. And so it just kind of became more and more interested in weather after that.
Oh, that's so cool. And thank you so much for sharing it. I mean, Houston is Home is our podcast, so we want to be able to share insight into that. And you're moving to Houston. What did you know about Houston's weather before you got here? And did you expect some of those things? I know that was really the first storm that you saw, but what was that process for you, and how did that kind of come about?
Well, I grew up in Michigan, and so I was, had never really seen a hurricane or a tropical storm, or really thought all that much about them. And then I went to school at the University of Texas and some other places, a graduate school in Missouri. And so I ended up down here in 97. And what I knew about the weather was it was hot. I lived in Texas for a few years in Austin, but you don't really get the full humidity effect in Austin that you do in Houston. So I knew it was hot and humid. I didn't also realize that, at times highways turn into rivers, which happened during Allison and has happened subsequently in several other storms as well.
Yeah, awesome. So right now, you're working with Space City Weather, so you've kind of transitioned from that writing with the Houston Chronicle into Space City Weather. What was kind of, did you expect to have the following that you have now through that, and how the opportunity to share the message that you get to share and keep people safe, really?
The answer to that is no. It's interesting. Back in 2005, with hurricanes Katrina and Rita, I did a fair amount of writing about weather online, blogging at the time. And again, during Hurricane Ike, I did a similar kind of thing. I wasn't a meteorologist then, but just kind of sort of helping people understand what expectations of what they could, anticipate, what was known and what was not known, really from a reporting standpoint. And that had proven, really popular during Ike. Which was in 2008, a Category 2 hurricane that had this huge storm surge that pushed into, Galveston and Bolivar. But then after that, there really wasn't that much crazy weather from 2008 onward. We had a really bad drought and heat in 2011, but nothing in the tropics really that was kind of crazy. And so I had gone on and gotten my certification in meteorology and was writing about it, but sort of like attention in weather sort of is pretty flat most of the time. Then when something extreme happens, it goes way up and then it comes back down. So I remember, I did decide to leave the Chronicle in the fall of 2015, so almost 5 years ago. And the idea was I was going to go work for a publication called Ars Technica and write about space, which is something I'm really interested in. And I had a following at the Chronicle for weather. I wouldn't say it was huge, but there were certainly some people who appreciated it. And I remember, that weekend we were just beginning to see some of these really big rain events, like the Memorial Day floods, some things like that in the 2015, 2016 timeframe. And so I just decided, one of those things was going to happen that weekend. And I was just going to start a little weather site to kind of keep it going. It was really just a hobby.
And it just kind of blew up from there once you really got started. That's so cool.
Well, it didn't blow up immediately, as Terry alluded to earlier. I mean, it was really Hurricane Harvey that precipitated kind of the explosive growth, because we had never done any kind of advertising, and so really it was people telling friends and family members that we were a good place to get information. And so it was during Harvey that we had this explosive growth in terms of attention on Facebook and Twitter, that the people just really shared the site, and it went pretty viral. And one day, I think it was the Sunday, so we rained really hard Saturday night, and then Sunday morning. That Sunday, I think we did over 1 million page views, which was our record until Hurricane Laura, and then we pulled that away during Laura. But that was really sort of the when we kind of exploded into the public consciousness, I think, in Houston.
Yeah, it's so cool, especially right now coming towards the end of hurricane season. It's interesting to see like how people were tuning into you with Hurricane Laura and with Tropical Storm Beta just recently, like what people were looking for, and looking for you as a resource to them to keep them safe, to let them know what's going on and what's happening through the process. And like Charity mentioned, that no hype, like you just giving it to us how it is. This is what we see. It could change, and not like guaranteeing anything, but this is what you're seeing. This is the real process, and people are taking that in, and it's not, people aren't freaking out from it as much, and they're just able to prepare and know what's actually coming. So I appreciate you for that as well.
So on the blogging format, that's something that I was wondering about, because most weather that we see is video forecasting, with all the swirls. I was telling Austin, there's all the swirls, and they're like, what does it mean? But I can go to your site and I can actually understand what it means for me personally, and that's what I appreciate the most. But what made you choose to do blogging as a format?
Well, I've never I mean, look, I've never really been one for video, but I started blogging way back in 2005, and it seemed like a really convenient way to communicate with people. I mean, I think I'm best in communicating in the written form, and so that was a good way. So like one of the interesting things was, before the internet, if you were writing for a newspaper, which I was, and you wanted to communicate information about weather, at the very latest, you were writing on a 10 p.m. deadline, right? And so the paper would come out the next morning. Someone would get it 6, 7, 8 o'clock in the morning, and by then the forecast was 12 hours old.
Right.
And you can see significant changes in the forecast in that time. And so when the internet came along and I was able to embrace it at the Chronicle, it really did sort of flatten that advantage that TV had. And certainly, a TV station has much more resources in terms of they have graphics packages that they buy that are produced by private companies that send them to them, and they can get on and talk sort of, videos and very sort of graphically put it together. But what I like about our site is that, it's really just kind of what we think people probably ought to know about a given storm, like, what we know, what we don't, and here's when we may know more. And so, if you're looking for that information, you don't have to maybe sit through, 20 minutes of sort of banter and then some information, then someone's out in the field, with water coming up, and then there's a forecast and there's commercial, whatever. And that's fine. I'm not criticizing TV at all.
Right.
They have their own business and so forth. But for us, it was really just a way to kind of just give people the information that they need in a pretty simple and straightforward way.
Absolutely. I love that you tell me when your next update is coming, because that's always the question. My husband says my favorite question is, and then what? And what happens next? So I always know when to expect the next update, and I'm checking back in. So thank you for that. That's really helpful.
You'll notice on that. Now, I always beat the deadline by 30 or 45 minutes.
You do. I'm impressed.
He's always pushing. And that's because I've been a journalist for 20 years. So I'm very used to writing on deadline.
Yeah. Absolutely. Every time I go there, at the time you said, it's already up. So thank you for that, because especially when your creek is flooding and you're wondering what's going on, it's comforting to know somebody's out there, they're watching, they're going to give me an update. So thank you. What's the best part about what you do now in Space City Weather and blogging? And
I'll tell you. I've been in Houston now for almost 25 years. I met my wife here. We've raised our family here. Met a lot of good friends here, and it's been a great place to live. So I like the theme of your podcast. But Houston's been really good to me, right? I've had a successful career, and so it's nice to be able to sort of slot into the community and give back in a meaningful way. And it's really been interesting to me to see how Space City Weather's profile has grown and how we're really viewed by a lot of people in Houston as like a valued resource, right? And that's not trying to toot my horn. It's just like saying, like, a lot of people do rely on us and sort of look to us for what's really going to happen in sort of this age of uncertainty about information. And so I think that being able to give back to a community that has been so good to us is something that Matt and I really, really value.
And congratulations to Matt on his new baby right during beta. How's that for coworker? Respect.
Yeah, it's nice. It's nice to have older kids in times of a storm, because you can really focus in. And say, y'all need to go entertain yourselves. And
they're not quite as unpredictable as those newborns. So what's the most challenging part about what you do?
Sometimes it's really difficult to separate, the emotions that you're feeling with sort of trying to get out of forecast, right? Because, I remember, during Harvey, that's Saturday night, Sunday morning. I mean, when you're just sitting there listening to the rain come pounding down forever and ever, it emotionally, I'm feeling everything else, things that everyone else in the community is feeling. Like I have a house, I have a house too that's threatened, and so it's really sort of processing that while also keeping focused on the forecast, all the time. And because it is such a lean operation, it is just Matt and I, like, during those long events, and Harvey was like a 10-day event, and Laura was like a week-long event, and Beta was a week-long event. It's like, it's all day, every day. And so it becomes a grind to sort of deal with that on top of sort of your own issues. So yeah,
I can imagine for sure, especially having your own personal experience that was traumatizing in the beginning. Like, what are we living through? And knowing that other people are feeling that too, and trying to still provide a calm, truthful, valuable resource to them. So
yeah, it's hard to remain calm when your part of your brain is screaming like, "Oh my God!"
It's really hard to stay within your no hype.
Yeah, exactly right.
But we appreciate you doing that. So what do you and your family do personally to prepare for hurricane season, with you knowing so much now?
I mean, it's basically, there's a few steps you can take that we take. Obviously, we make sure that there are enough supplies to ride out a hurricane, and so that's having a few extra cases of bottled water sitting around in July, August, and September. That's having all of our important documents, insurance papers, tax documents, identification, things like that in a safe location in the house, so that worst comes to worst, so we need to grab that and go, we can. And it's really having an understanding of the different risks that your home is vulnerable. So if you live in Seabrook, right on the water, you're not vulnerable at all to an inland rainfall flooding event, because if it rains 25 inches in Seabrook, that water is just running into Galveston Bay and out in the Gulf of Mexico. Like, you are not going to flood, during an inland rainfall event, typically, like you would in West Houston or in Lake City or so forth. Whereas if you're in West Houston along, one of the big reservoirs, the Attucks-Barker area, you are not at risk for storm surge, right? You could get a 40-foot storm surge, which has never happened, but you could get a 40-foot storm surge and you're fine. However, you are vulnerable to inland rainfall due to proximity to those reservoirs, and the final thing is wind. If you're on Galveston Island, you're a lot more vulnerable to wind than you are, say, if you live near Hobby Airport, and you're a lot less vulnerable to wind if you're in Katy or the Woodlands. So it's each person sort of needs to understand, okay, what are the vulnerabilities of my house or business to hurricanes, different threats? How can I address those threats in advance? And then at what point would those threats become great enough for me that I would actually evacuate? And so if you sort of figure all that out, and then decide, okay, and if I were to evacuate, where would I go? And a good tip is, if there's a storm in the Gulf that we think could potentially threaten Houston, I'm making a hotel reservation or a bed and breakfast reservation, or something in the Hill Country or in Dallas or somewhere 3 or 4 or 5 days in advance that I can cancel. Because if you wait to the last minute on that, those places may fill up.
Yep.
So, it's really understanding your risk and making a plan for how to deal with it is my advice. And that's what obviously what we do.
Yeah. So, I mean, you talked a little bit about Allison, and then you talked about Rita, or not Rita, but I wanted to kind of go to Rita because you talked about like the evacuation plans and those type of things. And when Ike and Rita came during that time frame, evacuation was a huge process that people were going from, and there's a lot of people that got scared during that process of evacuating again. And I think we've seen that in like Harvey and other storms. Like, people are like, oh, I'm not evacuating because I don't want to get stuck on the highway for 4 hours. What are some things that we can do to kind of mitigate that? And I think really you help us mitigate that with you reaching out and providing insight and doing those type of things. So what else do you feel could help with those type of scenarios and situations that might occur?
So let's go back to Hurricane Rita. That was 2005, September. Just about 15 years ago, actually, as of a couple of days ago, was the anniversary of the worst part of the evacuation. That evacuation was historic because it came 3 weeks after Hurricane Katrina. And so you had a lot of people from Louisiana who had evacuated to Houston, and you had sort of pictures of New Orleans still fresh in people's minds about sort of being stuck at the Superdome or being rescued off roofs, and so everyone was kind of freaked out. However, Rita was the worst case storm for Houston. If you go back and look at the forecast 2.5 or 3 days before landfall, so the time you really need to make the decision on calling an evacuation, it was a terrifying storm. It had maximum sustained winds of 175 miles per hour, and it was forecast to make landfall, 50 or 75 miles down the coast from Galveston. And that is the worst case scenario storm, potentially category 5 making landfall down the coast from Galveston. So you have the strongest winds and surge over the metro area. That would have been devastating. And so, yeah, people got the hell out, and that was the right decision because now where we screwed up, where the messaging was messed up was, you really need to call Galveston Island and then Galveston County and Brazoria County first, because those coastal residents are the ones vulnerable to surge. They need to get out. So the community did learn lots of lessons after Rita. That's the point I want to make. We are in a much better position as a city, multi-county, and state because of Rita. There are plans now. There were no plans at the time to implement contraflow, which means that you would open up both sides of the freeway on I-10, on I-45, and maybe 290 to allow people to just get out, right? We now have those contingency plans, and they can be implemented quickly. There are plans to stockpile fuel and food in communities that need to evacuate and along the evacuation route, so you don't have people running out of gas along the way. And there's also a much better understanding of the messaging of, typically you run from a storm surge and hide from wind. And that means basically, like, if the storm is going to push a big storm surge and you're within 10 feet of, the sea level, you need to go, right? But if it's forecast to be 120 mile per hour winds, typically the advice is to stay behind, unless, losing power for a week or two would be really threatening to you, things like that. So on a number of different fronts, since Rita, we are much better positioned. And I think you saw that during Hurricane Ike, because the Ike evacuation, while there were certainly some problems, the mayor of Galveston waited way too long to call an evacuation during Ike, among other things. But there was a more staggered approach during Ike. And during Laura, the forecasts were more accurate because just the models are better 15 years later. And also sort of that better understanding allowed the county judge, Harris County Judge, Nina Hidalgo, and other officials to sort of make better decisions and smarter decisions. And ultimately, we avoided an evacuation. I mean, I could very easily have justified a large scale evacuation, at least of areas south of I-10 on the Tuesday morning before Laura made landfall. It looked pretty serious at that time. Obviously, the storm turned quite a bit, and we really didn't see any effects here. But I think we're getting much better at that. I don't think we'll ever see a situation like Rita again. However, the caveat to that is that at the time, there were about 5 million people in the metro area, and now it's 7 million people. Yep. And so every year there's more people down on the coast and other parts of the area. So even as you're better prepared and making smarter calls on evacuations, there are just more people to evacuate. So,
it's got to be something that we continue to focus on and continue to grow in as a city and put that in infrastructure into. And that's another thing we really want to talk to you. I know we got a few more minutes left, but talking about, especially with in one of your last posts, you were talking about Tropical Storm Beta and how it really tested our systems and things for hurricanes that were implemented after Hurricane Harvey. So what are some things that you think we can take away from that so we can improve on, just like we did with evacuation plans or those type of things? So it sounds like we're getting in a place where those are under control, or at least where we can kind of forecast them or have a plan of attack. But now with Beta testing us with things that are implemented after Harvey, what things can we do, or what do you feel for like flood mitigation or those type of things for Houston?
Yeah, so there's three main threats from a hurricane. There's storm surge, which Hurricane Ike tested in 2008, and there's been talk about building a coastal barrier, or Ike Dike, or something like that. And 12 years later, we're still talking about it. And so, there seems to be a little bit of movement. I know the land commissioner, George P. Bush, is pushing it, and some of the local officials are talking about it. County judge and mayor are fully supportive for the first time. So hopefully that moves a little bit, because there's so much vulnerable to storm surge. The second one is inland rainfall, which you mentioned, which Harvey, I'm confident, represents sort of the reasonable worst case scenario. Like in our lifetimes, if we see another flood storm like that, we need to get out. Houston will not be home anymore if that happens again, because that was really a historic storm. And we've seen some steps taken to widen, like work on Braze Bayou was completed. There's been some other work, to widen things, but we have not made the kinds of smart decisions about increasing the size and digging new retention ponds, fully widening bayous, putting restrictions on development, in the sense that if you're going to build up an area, you need to make sure that you're flood neutral. So you need to have a set amount of set aside for, storing, retaining rainwater, things like that. And that's really going to take local, state, and federal action. And we just haven't seen it. And frankly, Beta was a pretty piddling tropical storm, in the sense that, it really had one main rain band. It didn't have 3 or 4. That rain band was only 10 to 15 miles wide. It just happened to set up over the I-45 corridor, which is why places like Pearland and Friendswood, saw so much rain. And the other thing about it is that because of all the dry air in the mid levels of the atmosphere, the rainfall rates just weren't that high. Even within that rain band, the rates were generally 1.5 to 1.5 inches of rain. And during Harvey, we saw rainfall rates in excess of 6 inches per hour. And it's really the rainfall rates that drive that really flat, kind of fast flash flooding, that where the water just starts rising and doesn't stop. And while Clear Creek flooded, and there was some water in homes, and obviously it got pretty high, and that was partly due to all the rain. It was about 15 to 16 inches of rain over parts of that basin, and also the surge coming in from Beta, had already raised water levels, and that makes it more difficult for the bayous to drain. We saw 4 to 6 to 8 inches of rain over other bayous, like Buffalo Bayou, White Oak Bayou, Cypress Creek, that brought those bayous up to the edges of their banks. And that's just not that much rain for Houston. That is not a rare rainfall event. And so, my take home message from Beta was that, if we, sorry, this is terrible, but if we beta tested, the region's flood system after Harvey, it failed, because it literally brought the bayou system to its knees. And we will see storms much worse than Beta, in the near future.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing that. And I know one thing that we really want this podcast to be about is to be able to celebrate the people and places of Houston that call Houston home. And that's what we're doing. That's why we're fortunate to be able to have you, because we want to celebrate you. And we also want to challenge people and be a resource for them, just as Space City Weather is. So if we could challenge people to, whether it's fighting for flood mitigation or doing those things, like, we want to be able to do that, and we want to be able to be a place where people can come and be educated and learn and dive into. So we're so grateful that you took the opportunity or the time out of your day to speak with us and share a little bit about your history from moving to Houston and kind of what drives your passion, and sharing your knowledge with us. So thank you so much for your time. I truly appreciate it. And I know Charity does as well too.
Absolutely.
So,
thank you.
Closing out, we'd love to just hear why you call Houston home and what you love about Houston. And then how can people find you? How can we support you? And what can we do to help the city of Houston as a whole?
Yeah, so there's many things to love about Houston. There's always been the saying, it's a nice place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there, right? Places, and I think Houston's the opposite of that. It's not a nice place to visit, but you would want to live here.
Yep.
Because, you know, the food is great, the people are nice, houses are affordable, there's lots of amenities, the economy is good. So it's a great place to live. My hope, in addition to addressing flood mitigation, is that everyone would be nice to one another, because that's the thing and that's why I like your podcast. But I mean, on our site, like, people are just so nice and so appreciative, and it's really, that's one of the things Matt and I love. I mean, it's just, people are obviously very grateful for what we do. And, you know, on places like Facebook, that often isn't the tenor of the conversation.
For sure.
So my hope would be that you know, Houston, we're all in this together. So let's sort of hold hands. Let's not sort of shake fists at one another. To find me, it's easy. You just Google Space City weather or Houston weather, and we pop right up. So
awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's been a true honor. So be safe. Have an amazing rest of your week, and get ready for this fall front that we got coming through.
I'm excited. I'm gonna be, Monday morning is gonna be like Christmas Eve. So
awesome.
We love talking to Eric today. That was so much fun. You can tell when someone is passionate about what they do, and that certainly came through with him today. So thank you all for joining us for this conversation. Another amazing story from someone who calls Houston home.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And be sure to follow us on all social media platforms at Houston is Home. Also subscribe to our YouTube channel, and hope you're tuning in on all major podcast platforms. So thank you all so much. Look forward to our next episode and continuing to call Houston home. Have a great one, and talk to you all soon.